Chapter 7, Genesis chapters 10 through 12. Babylon is evil. The story of Noah leads to another chapter of names we don't know. But before you skip this section, we know you want to. Note that it begins, "These are the descendants of," the fourth of 10 sections of Genesis. So right there, we know that these names are important enough to get their own section heading. Remember that lists of names clearly meant something to the Israelites who recorded these stories. They were former captives in a foreign land, determined to remember that they were the people of Yahweh, despite the national tragedy of exile. This list of nations in chapter 10 recounts how the descendants of Noah's 3 sons spread out to become the various people groups of the ancient world. This genealogy shows that the Israelites, the descendants of Shem, were the center of God's plan after the flood. The first son of Noah is Japheth, and 14 nations are named that descend from him. They are said to occupy what are now parts of Turkey and Greece, along with areas further south. Each of these 14 nations has its own language. This detail will be important in a minute. Ham, mentioned second, is the dark ancestor of pretty much anyone who will give the Israelites some sort of trouble later on. 30 are mentioned in Genesis chapter 10, verses 6 through 20, including the Canaanites, Egyptians, Assyrians, and Babylonians. These latter two settled in Shinar. See verse 10. This will also be important in a minute. They too have their own group of languages. Finally, Shem and his family are listed along with their own languages. Shem is where the word Semitic comes from, which for us today has become a synonym for Jewish. Here it refers to the people group from which the Israelites came. This list functions like the last list in Genesis chapter 5, which focused on the story of Seth's family and fast-forwarded us to Noah. This list in chapter 10 focuses our attention on Shem's family, fast-forwarding us to Abraham, the central figure of Israel's humble beginnings. But before we get to Abraham, as if to make a point one last time before moving on, the writer takes a slight detour to the land of Shinar and an ill-advised construction project. Those Babylonians again. We have a list of nations in chapter 10 and Adam's family tree starting at Genesis chapter 11, verse 10. Sandwiched in between is a curious story that takes up only 9 verses, a story that begins rather abruptly. Now the whole world had one language and the same words. Really? We just read, not 5 seconds ago in chapter 10, that there were 3 basic people groups, each with their own language, in chapter 10, verse 5, verse 20, and verse 31, that were spread out as 70 nations all over the known world. What gives? Did the biblical writer not know he was putting a story in Genesis chapter 10 that contradicted the next story in Genesis chapter 11? Was he asleep at the editing table? Or did he just have bad organizational skills? If he wanted to confuse us, mission accomplished. But the writer is not trying to confuse anyone. He is trying to get the reader's attention, and putting these stories together like this is not an act of carelessness. To see the point, we must remember, once again, that Genesis was put together by Israelites who had been captured by the Babylonians, as in the Tower of Babylonians. Our little 9-verse interlude assumes the existence of one people with one language settling in the plain of Shinar. Remember who settles in Shinar in chapter 10? Oh, just the Babylonians, the enemies of Israel who will later destroy their temple and take them to Babylon. This post-flood group comes together to build a famous tower to reach into the heavens. This type of ancient structure, known as a ziggurat, is well known today through archaeological discoveries as a common structure of worship in the ancient world. It looked like a pyramid with stairs for sides and an altar on top. Since the gods were up there somewhere, building a stairway to heaven was an attempt to get in touch with the gods. By contrast, Israel's worship structures, the tabernacle, and later the temple, didn't have steps going up to heaven. Instead, Israel waited for God to come down. But the Babylonians had their share of ziggurats, and this story sure reads like a slam on Babylonian arrogance and pride for building a structure to heaven to get God's attention. God's response in this story is both comical and ironic. 1. God has come down to see this high-rise building that supposedly reaches heaven in chapter 11, verse 5. And number 2, the tower is built to keep the people from being scattered over the earth in chapter 11, verse 4. Yet, that is exactly what happens. The confusion of languages is a play on words. The Hebrew word for confuse is balal, which the writer treats as a pun on the Hebrew word Babel, as in Babylon, which also happens to be where our word to babble comes from. This story does not give a historical account of where languages come from. It is a clever political satire as we move to the story of Abraham. Those silly, stupid, arrogant Babylonians. Also, think of this episode as the inverse of Genesis chapter 6, verse 1 through 4. There, the sons of God break through the boundaries of God and that God has set up for the cosmos and come down with grave consequences. Now, these Babylonians are trying to break through the cosmic boundaries by going up to get to God's level. Much later in Israel's story, the Babylonians will rebel against the true God when they sack God's house, the temple in Jerusalem, and then carry Israel and the temple treasure off to Babylon. This story is a way for latter Israelites to say, "At it again, huh? We know all about you Babylonians. We know how you began, and it seems that things haven't changed much." Chapters 10 and 11 give us two different explanations for why people are spread out around the known world and speak different languages. The list of nations in chapter 10 shows the people spreading out throughout the world after the flood, just as they are supposed to do in chapter 9, verses 1 and 7. They are fruitful and multiplying, which yields 70 nations, a number of completion or perfection. Chapter 10 also takes a good swipe at one of Israel's later enemies, the Canaanites. The story of Babel in chapter 11, however, paints the fact of national language differences in a bad light, blaming the Babylonians for this confusing mess. This story points a condemning finger at Babylon. You have been an annoying, destructive, godless pain in the side from the beginning. These two explanations of the disbursement of humans with their different languages were clearly not a problem for the writers and editors of the Old Testament, and we should not make it one, insisting that they both need to say the same thing. Failed humanity? Meet Abraham. And with that episode, we are on the verge of something new yet again, another chosen one, Abram, later to be renamed by God Abraham, who will be the father of one nation, Israel. Genesis chapters 1 through 11 as a whole has led us to this point. The world is a mess, but there is one line to be traced from Adam to Seth to Noah to Shem and now to Abraham that God intends to use to clean up the mess. Or better, let's say that God is moving to order chaos once again, not as in the days of Noah by wiping the slate clean, but by working through a people set apart for him, as were Adam and Noah. The pressing question here is whether Abraham, this new Adam, will work out. And he does, though not without moments that cause readers to panic, and then culminating in a truly unexpected development. Enter Abraham, whose story is introduced at the end of The Descendants of Shem in chapter 11, verses 10 through 26, in the fifth section in Genesis. But we quickly move to the sixth section in chapter 11, verse 27, with the descendants of Terah, Abraham's father. It seems like the writer is burning up his allotted 10 sections pretty early, 6 down, and we're not even out of chapter 11. But this sixth section will take a while. We won't see another one until chapter 25. After all, the line of Terah is about Abraham, the central character in Genesis, and along with Moses and King David, one of the 3 central characters in the entire Old Testament. Chapter 11 ends with Terah taking his family out of Ur in Babylon and moving them northwestward along the 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, to Haran, north of the land of Canaan. The writer adds here that Abraham's wife, Sarai, later called Sarah, is barren, which will become a key point in the story soon enough. The preliminaries are over. The writer has taken 11 chapters to prepare his readers to enter the story of Israel, from an extended family to eventually a nation destined by God to be blessed by God and to be a blessing to the nations. At least, that's the plan. The rest of the Old Testament will go into great detail about the struggle between God and Israel as God tries to move Israel toward their calling.